Stage is yours.
Thank you. Cheers, Matt. Hi, everyone, and thank you to the LIA for inviting me to speak at this excellent event. I was here yesterday, had a superb time yesterday afternoon. Last night, I know there are various bands on. I went to several talks, so I've had a really, really interesting time. It's also my first time in Riga, and I was taken around by LIA on Thursday night. What a spectacularly beautiful city it is. So, what I've been asked to talk about are the key issues that I look at in my next book, called Influencers and Revolutionaries. And what I've done in that book is to, from the perspective of the future of work, and from the perspective of the future of the workplace and the workforce, is to look at, on an international basis, what is happening amongst some of the most interesting international big legacy brands, the big global corporate giants, but also what's happening amongst some of the more interesting startups in some of the more interesting forward-looking cities. And so what I'll do now is go through, obviously at reasonable speed, what I think some of the key implications of that are from the point of view yourselves in Riga. Now, it's either from the point of view, let's say, from an angle of entrepreneurs, or from the point of view of the next generation workforce and from sort of Generation Z, or from millennials who may be looking to either enter the workforce or looking for their next role, or indeed are looking to start up their own outfit, or those who are looking to stay in the workforce at a later age, okay? So what I'm going to go through are a range of points. What I've done from the point of view of the screen this afternoon is just put these up as one-word slides that hopefully will be easier to remember and note down. So from the point of view of meaning, and I think this is a really interesting issue that we see going right through a number of different areas. We know, talk to any advertising agency or PR agency or media agency or forward-looking brand in any number of markets around the world, they'll tell you that this issue of people wanting to find meaning and purpose in their lives is absolutely intrinsic as a motivational driver. Consumers want to find more meaning in the brands that they purchase and consume. This goes across every sector, be it either cars or fashion, soft drinks, alcohol, banking, whatever. From the point of view of work, we now know, and it's really clear, it doesn't matter if you're having this conversation in Latvia or in Australia or the US, if you're in the Middle East or whatever, the point about people wanting to work for companies that have a genuine, authentic meaning behind the company's, as we say, foundation is really, really evident. People need to have meaning in terms of what it is that they do from the point of view of work. Now, it's interesting, when you're looking at work normally via either research reports or through the media, the first thing that we tend to see are those scare stories about AI and the march of the robots, and this is something that we should all be really, really concerned about, as we should. However, I think it was interesting to see only a couple of days ago in Shanghai when Jack Ma, one of the most important business figures on the planet, was debating with Elon Musk, another of the most interesting and forward-looking business people that there is. And one of the points that Jack Ma was making from the point of view of the future of work and the future workforce, as he foresaw a time soon in China when people would be working 12-hour weeks. That is 3 days a week, 4 hours at a time. Now, this coming from Jack Ma, who only recently was praising the Chinese work ethic, the so-called 996 work ethic, as in 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week, shows a fundamental change perhaps in his mindset in terms of where that is going. But certainly the issue of what will those people want from work when they are there, then meaning is a key part of that. The two key drivers that I look at through the book that I think connect every single sector in every industry, and this totally links into the future of work, but the two key drivers are the issue of climate change or the climate emergency, to give it its, say, proper profile, along with technological advancements from the point of view of, again, AI and 5G. The issue of environmentalism that, quite frankly, until recently, virtually every sector was ignoring, or certainly not paying enough attention to, is, I think, to state the stunningly obvious, going to become one of the key drivers of our time. You know, as we're here today in a glorious summer sunshine in Riga, the glorious Greta Thunberg obviously is in New York, going there to speak to the UN, having travelled across the Atlantic in the carbon neutral boat. And what we're seeing on an international basis is now this issue on a purely bottom line financial aspect of what is happening to companies, whether people agree with it subjectively or not, is that this is impacting companies in every sector. A classic example of a sector that until very recently was entirely ignoring this is the fashion industry. So if you look at fashion weeks, you know, Paris, New York, London, Milan, if you look at what's happening at them, very interesting that recently Extinction Rebellion, the most interesting movement at the moment that's happening on the planet, that's joining together interest groups of young people in particular around the world, have now focused on the fashion industry. From the point of view of fashion industry is now making up, they believe, about 25% of the world's carbon emissions. So, from the point of view of what does this mean for work, and particularly from the point of view of business owners, very interesting that the fashion industry that until recently was effectively ignoring this, but at the same time was always talking about, you know, the consumer is at the heart of everything, and now finding that people like Extinction Rebellion are saying, you know what, fashion no longer belongs to the fashion industry bosses, fashion belongs to us. So that issue of consumer control, that issue of worker control, that issue of people looking to see which companies they are looking to be employed by, which companies they are happy to stay being employed by, which companies they should be taking on from the point of view of innovation, is, I think, showing us just an example of that one sector, fashion, just how fast things are moving. And you can see already, obviously, in terms of, if you like, the major carbon emitters elsewhere, just how they're being taken on by the sort of the ecological groups, and how important this is from the point of view of, if nothing else, purely from the point of view of work, the sort of companies people are going to choose to work for or indeed leave. Collaboration, and I'll go through these at speed. Collaboration is another absolutely key area. So what are we seeing? So on one side, we know that there's an ever greater rise in people wanting to work on an autonomous basis by themselves, but we also know absolutely that, you know, we're social animals and that we like to work together. We need to collaborate. What I think we're going to be seeing more and more of, and again, very much AI or technology enabled, are people working in so-called swarms. That idea of small groups of people who need to work on a specific project, coming together, working on that project, clustering together, and then moving elsewhere. And they can work together either on an occasional face-to-face basis or purely through things like VR, in terms of VR meetings. And so that issue of swarm culture and specialist teams, people have specialist skills coming together and then moving apart, and companies also increasingly collaborating with each other to their mutual benefit, is something that we generally haven't seen before. Very few companies collaborate. Very few companies allow their workforces to collaborate with people from other companies. We're going to increasingly seeing this be the case. Again, classic example where this is being shown is currently in an industry that's normally very backward-looking. That is advertising, and what we're seeing from the holding groups, from people like WPP, is insisting that the best or most relevant people within the different agencies that they own come together, work together to the client's benefit. So this issue of collaboration, I think, is going to become hugely important. As I mentioned, is this idea of autonomy. What is autonomy giving us? It's giving us the ability to work for ourselves, by ourselves. We spoke about this, or I spoke about this yesterday with various city mayors and town mayors around Latvia, and what we're seeing here as an implication is that People are being enabled now to work in areas that basically are not the capital city, to put it really, really simply. So the idea that we can work from a really, really small village in the middle of effectively nowhere in the countryside is something that our grandparents or great-grandparents obviously couldn't do unless they're working physically within those areas, all being technologically enabled, and the benefit to small towns and small areas of people being able to either come back from big cities and work in rural areas is something I think is going to be hugely, hugely important as we see sort of a time go on. The idea of creativity. Creativity used to be viewed from the point of view of a small number of people were viewed as being, inverted commas, creative. So we talked about those with artistic skills essentially being creative and no one else was. Increasingly, we're seeing companies wanting to get the best out of a workforce, where increasingly we're seeing the reason that workforces are successful and the reason that companies are being successful is that their workforces are happier and more motivated and more content, which is a new thing in the world of work. You know, go back not too long when we had essentially large workplaces that were aimed at manual work, which effectively hadn't really changed since the Industrial Revolution. At that point, what we had was a situation whereby people effectively could be bullied and shouted at and hit to make them work harder. Whether they were happy or not didn't matter. The opposite is the case now in an information ideas economy, and it will become ever more the case that when people are content and motivated and happy and relaxed, they work harder. They work better. They are happy to work for longer. So that issue of, as the old saying has it, good business is an absolute truism. And if we're looking at how creativity is enabled and encouraged through businesses, it's all about those basic issues of whoever are heading up teams or putting teams together, and most teams are run on a horizontal reporting basis, not on the old top-down, top boss, second boss, etc., third basis, is effectively making sure people are aware what the objectives are, allowing them to fail, encouraging them, looking after them when they do fail, and ensuring that people do collaborate. And so this issue of encouraging creative working to take place throughout businesses is something that is, A, totally obvious, but it's amazing how few companies do it properly. The idea of fluid employment. More and more people, as we know, are going to be deliberately moving to a situation, just as Jack Ma was talking about in Shanghai only 2 days ago, when, first of all, they'll be working for shorter amounts of time whilst doing one specific role, but also more and more people will be having, as the saying has it, a side hustle or a second role or whatever. So if we see work in the future from the point of view of, in many, many sectors, people coming together in unusual or differing locations for a short amount of time, for a couple of times a week, and then going away and doing something else for themselves, or doing something else with someone else that has no relation to that first role, then I think this issue of people doing their own thing, having a so-called side hustle, is going to become more and more of an average, normal, a day-to-day situation. Diversity, we heard mentioned earlier on in one of the previous really, really fascinating talks by a couple of entrepreneurs. I think what we're seeing now is, again, and this goes through reports from people like everyone from the World Bank to the World Economic Forum recently, through to people like McKinsey or the Boston Consulting Group, all those, if you like, big, sensible, generally what can often be described as fairly dull organizations, putting out very, very coherent, sensible reports, is what they're describing as, and what they're illustrating as, diversity being ever more important in a globalized environment from the point of view of companies being effective. And what they're after is basically, if you take cognitive diversity. So if most people thought of diversity a decade ago as basically hoping to have a company that wasn't full of white middle-class people, most of them men. We then obviously moved from that to a situation whereby the classic example is, on a generational basis, the millennial generation will be very, very used to this because it's a life that they are living, because in most, certainly, leading-edge cities, obviously the reality we're dealing with is a societal makeup that is more and more diverse in nature. Putting aside the morality of that and just looking at it from the point of view of business effectiveness, if you're running companies, or if you're putting organizations together that have people who have different backgrounds, different skills, different points of view, that are questioning how companies do things, questioning them from the point of view of it doesn't have to be like this, then the results of that are entirely beneficial. So this issue of diversity not being encouraged from a purely moral point of view, as it should, but also being looked at purely from the point of view of, or additionally, from the point of view of pure business excellence, then that is absolutely where we're going. And as part of this issue of diversity, is we're also seeing this, the thing about multi-age workforces. Very soon, we're going to be seeing companies employing up to 5 generations. Again, this hasn't been seen, oddly enough, since the Black Death. Now, the reason for this is that, again, in an information economy, we're not seeing like the boomers and the grey generations effectively having to leave work. Now, on one side, what this can do is lead to conflict within companies from the point of view of new workers coming in, the existing millennials and then Generation Z workers being irritated that basically the older workers aren't leaving. The benefits that we're seeing is that basically on a general stereotypical basis, if you look at the boomers, then what they all tend to be offering is they are very, very uncompetitive. They're very, very unaggressive in terms of the way they behave at work, because effectively they are very, very pleased that they're still there. So the nurturing aspect and the experience aspect that boomers can bring to businesses, or businesses can retain by keeping hold of those people, are entirely useful, alongside an existing newer millennial workforce that obviously are far more akin with all things AR and VR and MR and AI, etc. So each generation does bring its own unique benefits to the workplace. When again, you can see at the moment, things like Generation X, the ones who grew up playing video games, are the ones who are now effectively running most companies or corporations. Gender, another massive issue. If we can see, for instance, in the tech industry, what the tech industry needs more than anything else are more women. Now, when the tech industry in general really got going, we know that the original coders, the original software geniuses were virtually all women, and yet somehow the tech bro culture pushed them out. Again, we think this is one of the reasons that the aggressive similarity and the copying behavior that's gone on in Silicon Valley, that in many cases has basically been very inward focused and hasn't considered society, has enabled in many cases those businesses to go down those routes that gave us things like the Cambridge Analytica scandal, obviously, that was all about Facebook and linking into Donald Trump's tragic sort of victory in the 2016 election. So that issue of, if nothing else, on that angle of tech bros being pushed out of Silicon Valley and out of Shenzhen, and more women coming into the tech workforce, is something that they desperately, desperately need. On a tribal basis, and again, I'll go through this fairly swiftly because the film slightly overrun earlier on, we're seeing, again, more and more workforces being drawn together via common interests. Also more workplaces doing the same thing. So if we look at workplaces from the point of view of, just say, interesting locations like Makerversity, where makers are coming together, we look at places like Brooklyn Boulder in Brooklyn in New York that essentially was set up in a climbing location, and they realized that people in between doing their climbing workouts were also checking their emails and doing some work, and they thought, let's turn this into a co-working space like the one we just saw just now in terms of Second Home in London. That angle of bringing together like-minded people who have a specific interest and getting them to work together in teams or individually, particularly in co-working spaces, is another area that we're going to see taking off. As is this whole thing about well-being culture. Again, if we agree that effectively, unless you're very unusual, everyone here today and all of your friends and your families and your work colleagues, etc., if everyone is, stressed out, if everyone feels overloaded by modern life, if none of us are getting enough sleep, if we're concerned about the issues of, as we should be, the environmental catastrophe, if we're looking at issues like the concerns about populism around Europe, the issues around the impact of Donald Trump in the White House, all those things, again, purely in a work context, are pressures people are bringing to work. And as I mentioned earlier on, until fairly recently, it didn't seem to be a need in terms of successful companies having happy, content workers. If companies are now going to be considering the mental health of their workers and their workforces as never before, as they should, again, a result of that is going to be more successful organizations of all types, be it governmental, public businesses, private businesses, or whatever. So the issue of ensuring that workforces are happy and healthy, which effectively would have been a notion that would have been laughed at 20 years ago, is going to become ever more of an intrinsic point of view to either attract workforces or get people to keep working for you. Again, this issue of education is massive. So, what are we seeing? Increasingly, and there's a report put out, I think, about 10 days ago by Deloitte that looked at, and they did a huge amount of research into this, and they found out about 73% of people viewed that their work skills, what they've been taught in their workplace, were more useful than their educational skills. And if we know, again, that we're going to be going through, if you're a millennial, you're going to be effectively rebooting your mental software over and over again throughout your working life, which will be a very long working life. So, what are we seeing? A couple of classic examples of this are universities really worrying that they're going to be losing future students who are just instead going straight past the university offering and going straight into the workforce to be or workplace to be educated there. We're going to be increasingly seeing lots more short skill projects being put up by universities, lots more short courses, and again, many companies now offering consistent and sort of and long-term learning to their workforces in order to actually attract them. So the idea of education changing is a huge one. Just a couple of slides to go in terms of time. Community. This is something we're seeing impacting a whole range of areas. Retail is a classic example. When if you talk to any retail owner in any leading retailer around the world, they'll tell you that there's a sort of, the saying is that they should be effectively knocking the walls of retail units down to invite the outside community in. The most classic example, obviously, is everyone's favorite coffee shop. No matter where you are. Doesn't matter if you're in Riga, doesn't matter if you're in Tokyo or New York or LA or San Francisco or London, whatever. People tend to view their local cafe or coffee shop through its small link to the local community. You recognize people and all the rest of it. So, if we're going to be increasingly seeing businesses copying this idea and welcoming the local community into that physical space as a shared environment, everyone benefits as a result. It's until very recently been a point of view of most businesses that they shut everyone out. And yet, if you look at increasingly where people choose to work, either be in co-working spaces or in the lobbies of interesting hotels or in cafes, what is the common denominator? It's all about outsiders being made to feel welcome and communities being drawn in. Location, on that one, again, I think one of the previous speakers was talking about location's really important. I think the issue of location that's relevant here in Riga this afternoon is, again, linking back into things to say, like universities. We're increasingly going to be seeing more and more people wanting to be educated and or live and work in other cities. The idea of being able to, and I won't mention Brexit, but the idea of people being able to move around Europe and go to emerging, interesting, creative, unusual places is hugely important. I gave a speech many years ago with Richard Florida in Melbourne, and what Richard Florida spoke about very briefly was he wrote a very well-known book called Rise of the Creative Class, and the point behind the rise of the creative class was that he looked at so-called secondary cities, so cities that weren't the capital city in each country, offering far more by being creative and open and tolerant and welcoming and diverse, and by doing those things, by promoting that, as opposed to be just promoting like the big city fast-moving thing, more and more secondary cities became more and more successful, attracting people to them. So I think there's a huge issue. So that's the same thing about relocation. So the last couple of slides I'll mention are this. So this is just, if you like, the 5-line crib sheet. The issue there, so it's all about if you're a business owner, if you're setting up a business, then unlike, to say, the old days, when we go back to the Industrial Revolution, when bosses effectively looked at workers as people they owned and people they basically just had under their grasp, we're now seeing the total opposite being the case. Businesses don't own people. Businesses who want the right workforce should be in the business of attracting talent rather than owning it, in order to basically put themselves forward in a way that means people want to join them. The issue of emotional intelligence, Elon Musk 2 days ago in Shanghai was saying, in terms of the march of AI, if you want to be equipping yourself for the future, you want to be getting into either engineering or physics or art. Those are the three key things that Elon Musk sort of was talking about. But what he and Jack Ma, and indeed any amount of reports into the future of work agree on, is that in an artificial intelligence environment, with AI definitely being the key driver of international economies, is that the way that you future-proof yourselves as individuals against that is, if you say, thinking about one's emotional intelligence and approach to creativity, the things that AI cannot do. And also this issue about constant evolution. That is the one I mentioned from the point of view of constant learning, viewing yourself as effectively constantly rebooting your mental software. The old idea of going to university and learning a trade and what you learnt basically sticking with you throughout your life, unless you're, let's say, perhaps an engineer or a doctor, obviously is over. Now it is all about constant learning. So curiosity, being interested in other cultures, other things, has never been more vital. Being open to change, questioning what is going on, questioning the status quo, taking a very philosophical approach to received wisdom, to the way things are. So questioning what is happening is absolutely intrinsic. As I say, is this whole issue about creative thinking. So, I know it's been a very quick flick through, but we had to go fast because the film, I think, slightly went over. So that's what I'm talking about. So my current book, The Post-Truth Business, is all about truth and trust and transparency and privacy. From the point of view of that, to me, the truth and trust issue is so intrinsic to every relationship we have, on either a personal basis or on a work basis, on a voter basis, is absolutely vital. I think the issue of privacy has risen up the public agenda so fast over the last 18 months, it's quite extraordinary. 18 months ago, within reason, no one was that worried about their privacy from a tech point of view. Once they'd seen, for instance, the implications of what Facebook was up to, linking in with those like Cambridge Analytica, that in many people's viewpoint, myself included, gave us the hideousness of Donald Trump, is a really, really important issue now as we see things like facial recognition becoming ever more of a socially moral argument. But then from the point of view, say, of the next book, Influencers and Revolutionaries, it's all about looking at innovation and where things are going next, and where it links into things like the here and the now, in Riga today and the Riga of tomorrow, what's happening from the point of view of AI and smart cities, and what's happening from the point of view of future workplaces and future workforces. So it's all, to me, about agility and tolerance and open-mindedness. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean.
Okay.
It was great to have you here, to hear you here.
Did I see
Thank you very much.
Cool.